de Lenguas Clásicas y Literatura de la Universidad de Oxford desde el 2004 al 2008 y profesor de Literatura Latina de la Universidad de Oxford a partir del 2008. Realmente el profesor Harrison tiene un currículum muy abundante que creo que no haría falta aquí relatar en su totalidad, y bueno, únicamente le doy la palabra al profesor Harrison, que nos va a hablar de An Issue of Genre and Form in Roman Literature, Expanded Epigram in Horace and Propertius.
Thank you very much, Bernardo, for that kind introduction. Can you hear me? Good, thank you. This has been a wonderful trip to Mexico for me. We don't have terremoto in England. My brother lives in California, where they do have terremoto. So, but everyone has been very kind. You have been wonderful hosts, and I hope this is not my first visit to Mexico. So, my topic today, I hope everyone has a handout. At least. Because there's quite a lot of text to look at. So in the talk, actually, I will begin with Propertius and then say a little about Horace if there's time. We will see. Both the lyric of Horace and Propertius's elegy are medium-length forms which fall between the characteristic brevity of epigram and longer forms such as hexameter genres and drama. So to expand the short form of epigram is a natural strategy for both poets, especially as both poets share the Augustan interest in generic enrichment, as I've called it, in which existing poetic genres are enlarged and enriched through the experimental use of elements which obviously belong to other genres. Here I consider some examples from these two poets and the various strategies by which epigram material is inserted into these longer poetic forms. Though the phenomenon has been noted for a century or more, the recent easier availability of Hellenistic epigram, detailed modern commentaries on Horace and Propertius, and the discovery of new texts, such as the Milan papyrus of Posidippus, mean that we are in a strong position to provide a more detailed analysis. And I remind you of the recent detailed commentaries on Hellenistic epigram. Before that, we had Gowan Page, which was very basic, really. It did the basics, but not much else. David Sider's excellent commentary on the epigrams of Philodemus, Alex Sens on Asclepiades, and Kathy Gutzwiller will, we hope, soon produce her commentary on Meleager. But perhaps the most interesting thing are the new poems in the Posidippus papyrus, published now with the rest of Posidippus's poems by Colin Austin and Bastianini in 2002. And this is a particularly fascinating document because it does present the earliest evidence for Hellenistic epigram collections. It's actually a contemporary papyrus. And it's set out in thematic sequences, anathematic, offering epigrams, sepulchral epigrams, etc. So we now know a little about how Hellenistic epigram books were organized. Now, I mentioned that it's at least a century since people have been interested in epigram in these two poets, and I would like to acknowledge the great contribution here, as elsewhere, of German classical scholarship, the important article by Felix Jacobi, that's Jacobi of history fame, and he discusses Hellenistic love epigram as one of the ways in which Latin love elegy comes to be, as the ancestor of Latin love elegy. Another pioneer is Wilhelm Kroll in his great book Studien zum Verständnis der römischen Literatur, 1924. When I began studying Roman poetry with Professor Robin Nisbet, he told me this was the most important book on Roman poetry, and in some sense he was right, because many of the ideas in this book have, a century later, come out in scholarship. And so he says, many elegies are nothing more than expanded epigrams, and in some ways that is the story of the first part of my paper. But as often in that book, he doesn't give a lot of examples, he just gives you a great idea. More detail can be found on Horace and epigram in the article by Richard Weizenstein from 1908, and there he does lay out some important parallels with between Hellenistic epigram and Horatian lyric. But I think we're also able to look at this topic in a better way now because of important recent scholarship. Commentaries on Horace's Odes by Nisbet and Hubbard, Nisbet and Rudd, Richard Thomas. Commentaries on Propertius, especially those by Paolo Fedeli. I have said something in my book on generic enrichment 10 years ago. An important volume edited by Alison Keith, Latin Elegy and Hellenistic Epigram, A Tale of Two Genres at Rome. This book is very difficult to get, even in England and America, but it does have some important work. And finally, the article by Richard Thomas on Horace and Hellenistic poetry is important. And there are some elements in Gregory Hutchinson's Talking Books. So I think this is a topic which is developing in recent scholarship. So what I want to talk about is expanding epigram, that is to say, the way in which the short form of epigram is lengthened, or in other ways, played with in longer poems. And one way in which this happens, which I'm not going to talk about, is embedded epigram. This is where you find really epigrams in Augustan poetry. I cite the important article by Martin Dinter, who I hope will be here soon. He is at the conference, on epic and epigram in Virgil. Interesting book by Teresa Ramsby called Textual Permanence, where she looks at the moments in Roman elegy where the elegists quote or embed inscriptions, what purport to be funeral inscriptions particularly. Another article by Luke Houghton, Epitome and Eternity, along the same lines. So it's always nice to see that one is moving in the same direction as other scholars. So now I turn to the section on Propertius. I hope everyone at least has a sight of the handout. Now, there are some examples in Propertius books 1 and 2 of this kind of thing, but I think expanded epigram, these shorter poems being deployed in longer poems, becomes more visible in the later and experimental books 3 and 4 of Propertius. And in these books, interaction with other literary forms is very important, because these books are written soon after, in the case of book 3, soon after Horace's Odes, a very important poetic collection, and in the case of Propertius 4, soon after Virgil's Aeneid. So they are reacting to very significant publications in Roman poetry. So interaction with other kinds of writing is natural for these two books. And of course, epigram is a natural source for elegy, partly because they are in the same meter. You don't even need to change the meter. So I begin with an example from Propertius book 3, and that is 3:18. And here we have a lament for the prince, Marcellus, the son-in-law and, in effect, adopted successor of Augustus, who dies at a very young age. And here I think this poem can certainly be seen as an enlarged sepulchral epigram. So I will read the English translation, but I have given you the Latin on the handout as well. Where the sea plays, enclosed by shady Avernus, and the steaming pools of warm water overflow, volcanic earthquakes. Where the Trojan trumpeter lies on the sand at Euboean Cumae, and the track constructed by Hercules' labour resounds. Here once, when he was propitiously making for the cities of Italy, cymbals clashed for the Theban god. But now, Baiae, hated for your great crime, what hostile god has stopped in your waters? Overwhelmed by these forces, he, Marcellus, dipped his face in the Stygian waves. And that spirit wanders by the infernal lake. What has been the use to him of his birth or excellence or his noble mother, and the fact that he embraced the hearth of Caesar? Or the awnings fluttering recently in so crowded a theatre, and all things done by hands so young? He died, and the 20th year stood still for the poor boy. Time has closed so much good in so small a circle. Go now, lift up your spirit and imagine triumphs in your mind, and take pleasure in whole theatres standing to offer applause. Outdo the golden cloth of Attalus, and let everything be jewelled with Indian pearls. You will give these things to the power, yet everyone goes this way the highest class and the lowest. That path is an unpleasant one, but to be trodden by all. The 3 barking throats of the dog have to be won over. One must climb on the public ferryboat of the grim old man. Though that man cautiously case himself in iron and bronze, death yet drags out his enclosed head. His appearance did not save Nireus, nor his might Achilles, or Croesus the wealth which the water of Pactolus produces. But may the sailor who transports the shades of righteous men carry your body empty of its soul on that route by which Claudius, victor in the land of Sicily, and by which Caesar passed from the human road to the stars. So if we compare this to Callimachus's epitaph for Heraclitus, which I've also put on the handout, you can see that it treats the same topics in the same order. Someone told me of your death, Heraclitus, and brought me to tears. I recalled how many times we two laid the sun to rest in talk. But you, I suppose, my friend from Halicarnassus, are ashes so long ago, while your nightingales, your poems, live on, on which the robber Hades will never lay his hand. So here we have the news of someone's death, the key features of his life recalled, an observation on the power of death, the great power of death, and the idea that this person will somehow live on. My heart will go on. And if you look back at the Latin poem, you can see exactly the same structure. It begins with news of the death of Marcellus. It then recalls key features of his life. It has observations on the power of death. And finally, he will go on somehow, like various members of his family, especially Julius Caesar, who has become a god. So what I want to argue essentially is that Propertius takes the form of the sepulchral epigram and expands it into an elegy, and that this is easy because these two forms are related. And this does not occur in Fideli's commentary on Book 3. I was surprised. So here we have an example where a single poem takes an epigram and stretches it. But there are other ways in which these shorter poems can be used in the longer elegies of Propertius. So my next example is Propertius 4:2. This, you may remember, is a long elegy of 64 lines spoken by the statue of the god Vertumnus, who describes his own character. And for me, this seems to both to start and finish with embedded epigrammatic sections. So in essence, it has an epigram at the beginning and an epigram at the end. So I translate the first 6 lines, which you have on your handout. You who wonder at the many forms I have in a single body, learn the features that from the days of your forefathers have distinguished the god Vertumnus. I am Etruscan and come from Etruria, but I don't regret having deserted the hearths of Volsini in time of war. The crowd here pleases me, nor do I take delight in a temple decorated with ivory. It is enough to be able to see the Roman Forum. So he's describing his situation in the city of Rome. So this is 6 lines. This is the length of an epigram. And it recalls epigram themes. For example, in Callimachus, the speaking divine statue explaining its identity. That's exactly the case for the god Vertumnus. Epigram 24 from Callimachus. I, a hero, so a divine figure, am set by the doors of Aetion of Amphipolis, a small statue by a small vestibule, having as arms only a coiling snake and a sword. In anger with the cavalryman, he has set me to by his house on foot. Slightly ironic, but it's the same kind of thing. Or the epigram by Leonidas of Tarentum, spoken by a Herm, a statue of Hermes. O ye who pass along this road, whether you are going from town to the fields or returning to the city from the country, we 2 gods here are the guardians of the boundary. I, as you see me, am Hermes, and this other fellow is Heraclitus. So again, we have a god who names himself, tells us about his situation. And we know, I've given also some further references for speaking Herms in epigram, and of course, speaking statues of Priapus. So I think this is recognizably an epigram. Likewise, at the end of the poem, I think we have another slightly different type of epigram. I will translate the Propertius first. 6 lines will be found below. I do not delay you who hurry to answer bail. This is the finishing line of my circuits. I was a maple stump, fashioned by a hastening sickle, a poor god in a poor city before the days of Numa. But Mamurius, divine sculptor of my bronze form, may the Oscan earth not wear away your artist's hands, you who had the ability to cast me to be taught so many roles. It was a single work, not single, is the honor given to it. So here we have a statue which speaks and describes its own origins. I was a tree, now I'm a statue. And this is something we find in other epigrams spoken by divine statues in Hellenistic epigram. For example, where the statue of Priapus speaks, my next example, again gives an account of its own making and addresses passers-by, just as the statue of Vertumnus does in Propertius. Beware from afar off of the guardian set up in the kitchen garden. This is, of course, the role of Priapus to scare away thieves and birds. I am such as you see me, you who go past me, made of fig wood, not polished with ochre, nor carved by rule and measure, but by a shepherd's self-taught chisel. Laugh foolishly at me, but take care not to damage Euclid's property, or you may have to laugh grimly too. And this arrangement by which an artifact gives an account of its own manufacture, especially beginning with its own material, is often found in the Hellenistic epigrams. For example, Simmias, I, a bow, was once 2 horns. Anonymous one, I, a ship, was once a pine tree. Of course, a topos from Catullus and others. I, a pen, was once a reed. And this explicit address to passers-by by statues is certainly an epigrammatic feature, especially associated with Hermes and with Priapus. So I think we can see various epigram themes here, and again, it's in an epigrammatic length. Remember, epigrams are short, 4, 8, 12, 16 lines. This is 6 lines, and it says it's 6 lines. Sex superunt versus, there are 6 lines remaining. So I think here Propertius is pointing to the brevity of the epigram and pointing to the kind of literature that he is incorporating into his longer poem. So not only is he doing it, but he's telling you that he's doing it. So here the elegy is in effect both an expansion of a type of epigram, but also puts in to poems of epigrammatic length. And that pointing to 6 lines, I think, is a very clear indication that this is what is going on. Now we find this, so what we have here is partly an expansion of an epigram, but also the placing of poems which look like epigrams at the beginning and end of a longer poem. And when I started thinking about this, I thought there were other examples in Propertius 4, and one of these is Propertius 4:5. Again, a long poem of 76 lines. It's mostly reporting a meeting between the Lena, Acanthis, the old woman who, I suppose, is a manager of prostitutes, and the poet Amica. And most of it is the speech of Acanthis, who is persuading the Amica to be unfaithful for money. But it begins and ends with clearly recognizable epigrammatic elements, in effect with embedded epigrams of the right length on the same theme. So it begins with a curse on the dead. Acanthis is already dead. And this is in the opening 4 lines. Again, I read the translation. May the earth cover your tomb with thorns bored, and your shade experience perpetual thirst, which you do not wish, and may your ghost not settle in the ashes, and may Cerberus exact vengeance, terrifying your foul bones with a hungry growl. And then at the end, we have very much the same kind of thing, a curse on the dead woman. Let an ancient bottle with a broken neck be a tomb for the bored, and work your might down on it, fig tree. Every lover should damage this grave with jagged rocks, and mixed in with the rocks, let them add curses. So both the opening and the conclusion of this poem echo 2 Hellenistic epigrams which make scornful observations on the tomb of the same drunken old woman. Like Acanthis, she is a drunken old woman. And in one case, it refers similarly to an appropriate grave marker linked with her drunkenness. This is in the case of Leonidas at Tarentum. Here we have an epigram which is an iambic, so that's rare, but it does happen. Wine-bibbing old Morones, the jar dryer, lies here, and on her tomb, significant to all, stands an Attic cup. So the cup is for her drinking. She laments beneath the earth, not for her husband and children, whom she left in indigence, but solely because the cup is empty. And again, a very similar epigram by Antipater of Sidon. This is the monument on the same person, who was obviously a famous drinker. This is the monument of grey-haired Morones, on whose tomb you see a wine cup carved in stone. She, the wine bibber and chatterer, is not sorry for her children or her children's destitute father, but one thing she laments even in her grave, that the device of the wine god on the tomb is not full of wine. So you can see this exact topos of the wine vessel on the tomb. And in the case of Propertius, this is an amphora, marking out the drunkenness of the dead woman, the drunkenness which is a reason for attacking her. But the connections with epigram do not end here, because we also have the theme of cursing the tomb of a disreputable dead person. And that we find in Chronagris, who was an earlier contemporary of Propertius. And here we have an attack, this time on a man. The tomb above his odious head crushes the bones of the scoundrel who lies in this unhappy earth. It crushes the protruding breast and the unsavory saw-like teeth and the servilely fettered legs and hairless head, the half-consumed remains of Eunychides, still full of green putrescence. O earth, who has espoused an evil bridegroom, rest not light or thinly sprinkled on the ashes of the deformed being. So, yes, it's very unpleasant. But here we have a curse on someone who is unpleasant, who's physically ugly, as I think we think Acanthis is. And again, we can see that Propertius is using yet another type of epigram. So, 4.5, like 4.2, is an expansion of a type of epigram, the attack on the tomb of the drunken old woman or disreputable person, marked as such by embedded epigrams of the right length at both its beginning and end. These are epigrams of 4 lines each, which is the most common epigram length, of course. And they are placed at the beginning and end of the poem to show that this is a poem which has epigrammatic origins. Now I want to go on to perhaps the most fun poem in Book 4 of Propertius, the Elegy to Cornelia. And again, I think we have the same technique as found in 4.5, except this is a good woman. Cornelia is a good woman, Acanthus is a bad woman. They balance each other. In 4.11, as you may remember, the dead Cornelia, who's an important person, she is related to Augustus. She addresses her husband, who is a consul, again an important person, from beyond the grave in a long poem, 102 lines. Now, Gregory Hutchinson, in his good commentary on Propertius 4, has suggested that 4.11, as I quote, is an ideological expansion of an epigram on an object. But he wants to argue that the main type of epigram here is not Greek book epigram, but Latin epitaph. And of course, this has many connections with the Latin epitaphs that we know, the long verse epitaphs, the Laudatio Turiae, for example. So we got to Propertius 4.11, and the idea that we have, again, epigrams placed at the beginning and end. And I wanted to argue against the view of Gregory Hutchinson, who says that there is no Greek book epigram here, and I think that there is, and I hope to persuade you of this. So I begin with the beginning of the poem, where Cornelia, the dead Cornelia, addresses her living husband, Paulus. And again, I'll read the translation. Cease, Paulus, to burden my tomb with tears. The dark door is open to no prayers. When once the corpse has entered the domain of the underworld, the way stands fast with inexorable adamant. Even if the god of the dark court should hear your prayer, the shores are deaf, have no doubt of that, and will swallow your tears. Now notice how lacrimis and lacrimas enclose these 6 lines, perhaps marking it out as a unit. And my argument is that this is a unit, and it's a unit which is meant to reflect a Hellenistic epigram. Again, it's 6 lines long. This is the length of an epigram. Now, addressed to the family in sepulchral epigram is quite hard to find, and the best I could find was an example in Posidippus, where we have the speaker is dying but not yet dead, and he addresses his family as they stand around. I think this is a very similar scenario, even if the speaker is not dead. And here again, the collection of Posidippus is very handy. Again, it helps us with the study of epigram. So the Posidippus poem, this was the prayer of Ministratos when he descended to Hades from the pyre. Do not weep for me, children, but heap up the dear dust on your cold father, as tradition demands at the end. For at the age of 60 I departed the air above to go to the blessed ones, not heavy with age, but still light-footed. So here we get the address to the family that we have in the words of Cornelia. So I think this is an epigrammatic opening, and I also think that this poem has an epigrammatic close, and that's the next passage that you see. Long poem, but 2 short epigrams beginning and end. And things are well. Never as mother have I put on mourning. The whole troop came to my funeral. My case is complete. Witnesses rise, weeping for me, while the grateful earth repays the reward for my life. To those of good character, even the heaven is open. May I deserve through my merits that my bones be borne on the waters, travelled by the honoured. So here we get various topics from Epigram. The idea that it's good to be buried by your children rather than burying your children. Of course, not just in Epigram, that's in Herodotus and others. But there's a good example here again from Posidippus. Stop your steps by the memorial and speak to Aristippus, an old man cheerful in age. For here he is in death, and see his stone free from tears. This rock is a light weight for him beneath the earth, for his children buried him. Something most dear to an aged man, and he saw a second generation from his daughters. So I want to argue again that this poem begins and ends with sections which, in effect, are sepulchral epigrams, and so we can see the whole thing as an expansion of a sepulchral epigram. Of course, there are other things going on in the poem. It's a kind of speech, it's a kind of law court speech, but I want to argue that epigram and Greek epigram, book epigram, has its role here too. And again, notice 6 lines at the beginning and 6 lines at the end, that epigrammatic length. So I think we've got a bit of a pattern here. Now I turn to Propertius 4:6. And this is slightly different. I think what we have in this poem is a turn to epigram at the end of the poem. So it kind of becomes an epigram, or kind of adds on an epigram at the end. Now you remember that Propertius 4:6 is the poet's account of the Battle of Actium, framed as the Aition for the Palatine Temple of Apollo. And that's in lines 1 to 68, sorry. But then in line 69, we turn to sympathetic celebration. So, I have sung enough of war. Victorious Apollo now demands his lyre and removes his armour, ready for peaceful dances. Now let white-clothed parties go beneath the present grove, and delightful roses flow on either side down my neck, and let wine crushed in Falernian presses be served, and Cilician saffron drench our hair. Let the muse provoke the wit of drunken poets. Bacchus, you are usually a fertile source for your brother Phoebus. One may recall the servitude of the marsh-dwelling Sigambri, another can sing the swarthy kingdom of Capheum Meroe. Let a third tell of the Parthian, pacified by a late treaty. He returns the standards of Remus, in time to come he will yield his own. Or if Augustus shows clemency and spares the eastern quivers, let him postpone those trophies for his boys. Rejoice, Crassus, if you have any sensation amidst the black sand. It is possible to travel down the Euphrates to your tomb. That is how I shall spend the night, with cup and with song, until day casts its rays into my wine. So what we have here, I want to argue, is an expanded symposiastic epigram, an epigram which points to wine drinking and the party. So the grove of the Palatine is converted into a party location, complete with the usual wines and unguents and the all-night carousing. It's an all-night party. And we find all-night parties in epigram in Asclepiades. So again, I think this is recognizably an epigrammatic structure in a larger elegiac poem. I think we have some time for Horace, so I think I'll do another 10 minutes. Okay. Unless there's another alarm. So, of course, Horace in the Odes is writing poems to imitate the monodic Greek lyric of Sappho and Alcaeus. And here length is important. Partly he chooses this kind of lyric because it is shorter. It's not as long as the grand choral lyrics of Stesichorus. We know the Geryoneus had 1,300 or more lines, or even Pindar, where Pythian 3 has almost 300 lines. He chooses the Greek lyric of Sappho and Alcaeus. Now, we don't have many complete poems of Sappho and Alcaeus, but fragment 1 Poikilothrone Arthelet Aphrodita, the famous poem to Aphrodite, is clearly complete at 28 lines. And the poem addressed Kainos Moi Phainatai, fragment 31, might even have been complete at 20 lines. So Horace is imitating a kind of lyric which has short length. So that's one reason why he might be interested in epigram, another type of short poems. And if you look in the Odes, many of the poems are very short. Some are 8 lines long. But the Odes, Horace's lyric, also share key themes with epigram, love, the symposium, and so on. So epigram is an obvious source both for length and for material. And Horatian lyric is unique, I think, in having very short lyric poems, which look clearly to epigram models in line numbers and subject. So, for example, 123, erotic, has 12 lines. 126, on friendship, has 12 lines. 130, erotic, 8 lines. 138, sympathetic, 8 lines. 322, dedication, 8 lines. 326, dedication, 12 lines. 410, erotic, 8 lines. Now, I haven't got time to talk about all these, but I think there is a pattern here. These poems transpose epigram to lyric form of the same length. They are pretty much the same length. But what I want to consider here is where we have, again, as in Propertius, epigram elements used to build a bigger poem by expansion. Now, I've discussed some of this in my book 10 years ago, and I'll just cover this very briefly. So in Odes 128, this joins together 2 types of sepulchral epigram. First of all, the dead person is addressed by the poet-speaker, but then the poet-speaker turns out to be a dead person speaking from the tomb himself. So there you've got 2 types of epigram juxtaposed. In Odes 2.5, we begin with the first half of epigram length, 12 lines, which admires a young girl and clearly uses an erotic epigram of Philodemus. But then, in its second half, this poem turns to erotic themes from Sappho and other places. So there you have got expansion of an epigram. And Odes 2.13, the famous one about the poet's near escape from the falling tree, similarly opens with a first half which looks back to 2 types of Greek epigram: the dedication, which marks an escape from danger, and the sepulchral epigram, followed by a second half which looks to another different literary tradition, the epic tradition of catabasis. So there we have epigram topics linked with material from other kinds of material outside lyric. But as we'll see, both the techniques found here for expanding epigram into lyric, the putting together, the suturing together of 2 epigram types, and the use of epigram along with material from another literary genre to make a longer poem, can be paralleled elsewhere in the Odes. So I begin with Odes 3.14. Now here, as you remember, Horace welcomes Augustus back to Rome on his return from Spain in 24, in an ode of 28 lines, which divides into 2 clear parts. The opening 4 stanzas greeting the great man in the public context, and the closing 3 stanzas which turn to a private symposiastic celebration. And this is very like Propertius 4.6 we've just seen. So you get the public material followed by a private symposium, a symposium which is expressed in epigram terms. So we begin with the greeting of Caesar returning from Spain, indeed, which I won't translate, but I'll translate the bit at the end, E pete unguentum puer. Go, my boy, and look for scented ointment and garlands and a jar that remembers the Marsian war, if there is anywhere a croc that has managed to elude the marauding Spartacus, and tell the clear-voiced Neaira to hurry up, tying a band round her myrrh-scented hair. If any delay occurs on account of the odious doorman, come away. My greying hair is mellowing my temper, which used to be eager for wrangling and impulsive brawls. I would not have put up with this sort of thing in my hot-blooded youth, when Plancus was consul. So here I want to argue we have a clear symposiastic epigram type. We get the instructions to the slave servant that we find at the start of sympathetic epigrams, as well as in Horatian lyrics. For example, in that poem of Marcus Argentarius, pour in 10 ladles for Lycidice, but give me 1 ladle for desirable Euphrante waiter. And this shopping list element, you send off the slave to produce materials for the symposium, is found in a group of epigrams in Book 5 of the Greek Anthology by the great masters of Hellenistic epigram, by Asclepiades and Posidippus. And so the last 12 lines, there's 3 stanzas, the last 12 lines, this can be read as a self-contained sympathetic epigram, I think. So there we have a symposiastic epigram at the end. In Odes 329, by contrast, I think we have a symposiastic epigram at the start. And this is a long poem, the longest ode in Book 3, which begins by inviting Maecenas to a symposium in the first 3 stanzas, and then goes off to discuss the good life in Epicurean terms. And I want to argue that the first 3 stanzas of this poem, like the last 3 stanzas of 314, can be seen as a self-contained sympathetic epigram. But this time not the epigram of preparing for the symposium, but the epigram of inviting guests to the symposium. So, Maecenas, descendant of Etruscan kings, there is some mellow wine in a jar, not yet tilted, that has long awaited you at my house, along with rose blooms and balsam pressed for your hair. So tear yourself away and stop gazing out on well-watered Tibur and the sloping fields of Ephula and the ridge of the parasite Telegonus. Leave behind your blasé surfeit and the pile that almost touches the clouds overhead. Stop looking with admiration at prosperous Rome with its smoke, wealth, and noise. A bit like Mexico City. Here we can compare the tradition of inviting the patron in Greek sympathetic epigram to a humble dinner at the poet's house. For example, the poem by Philodemus, which I cite there. Tomorrow, dearest Piso, your friend, beloved by the Muses, who keeps our annual feast to the 20th, invites you to come after the 9th hour to his simple cottage. If you miss udders and draughts of Chian wine, you will see at least sincere friends, and you will hear things far sweeter than the land of the Phaeacians. But if you ever cast your eyes on me, Piso, we shall celebrate the 20th richly instead of simply. So again, I think we can see the opening as a detachable epigram at 12 lines, a starting point for the lyric poem to develop at much greater length. So I hope I have convinced you that using epigrams as building blocks is important both for Propertius and for Horace, and basically for the same reason that these are, well, perhaps slightly different reasons. In Horace, this is connected with his desire to write short lyric poems, so he looks to the short form of epigram. In the case of Propertius, I think it's also a recognition that epigram in the elegiac meter is an ancestor of love elegy. Muchas gracias.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias, profesor Harrison, por esta maravillosa conferencia, y yo creo que podríamos tener tiempo de alguna pregunta, como le hicimos ayer en la sesión de seminario que nos impartió el profesor Harrison. Si alguien quiere preguntar en español, creo que no hay problema, así que le cedo la palabra. Una pregunta, aunque sea. Sí.
Thank you so much for that talk. I was extremely stimulating, and I was just curious
Yeah.
And you just mentioned epigram being sort of an ancestor of love elegy. Do you see this use of epigram as tying into the logical focus?
Yes, I think that's a very good point. I mean, what happened, well, many things happen in Book 4, but one of the... Okay.
Sure. A few people are asking me to repeat it. So most of the Propertius examples are from Book 4, and I'm curious if the use of epigram in Propertius Book 4 is related to the etiological focus.
Ok, si el uso de los epigramas en el libro cuarto de Propertius tiene un ideological, what?
Yeah.
Etiological.
Yeah.
Etiological.
Yeah. So, I think these two things can be related. The ideological aspect of Book 4, the way that it explicitly names Callimachus, and says that Propertius is the Roman Callimachus, and clearly looks back to the Aitia, I think can be connected with epigram, because I think here Propertius is thinking about the history of elegy in Greek. As Ovid will later think about the history of elegy in Greek in the same way, in the Fasti and so on. And I think, so Book 4, Propertius is looking back in the history of his meter to see what he can do that is new. Because Propertius 4, remember, the Aeneid has just been published. Virgil's Aeneid has just appeared. What do you do after that? It's very difficult, and that's one of the themes of the book too. But I think that Propertius is looking back in the history of Greek elegiac writing, and that he includes epigram in that, and uses it to make new types of poem. And these are very experimental structures. And I guess the other thing is in Book 4, the poems are longer. And they're longer partly because of Callimachus' Aitia, Books 3 and 4, where clearly the poems were also longer. But I think this use of short epigrammatic building blocks helps him to construct longer poems. Just as epigram helps Horace to stay short, epigram helps Propertius to get bigger, if you like. Yeah.
Bueno, creo que las placas tectónicas no nos dejarán hacer más preguntas al parecer, así que les agradecemos mucho por su asistencia y los invitamos a la próxima conferencia. Es una mesa. Bueno, a la próxima mesa. Ok, a una mesa y luego la última conferencia. Muchísimas gracias.